Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for the fourth video in our series on sewing this buckskin shirt. This is the fifth video overall because we began with the leggings project, the leggings and breech clout here that I'm wearing for this full getup. If you're interested in, if this is the first video that you've seen on our channel and you want to start all the way at the beginning, link at the top of the screen to the leggings video, and the end screens will lead you all the way through the series. The leggings are a very traditional pattern measured directly from the body. We have more like that, more information on that process on the Patreon page. There's a nice big compilation of all sorts of historic resources on tanning and working with leather. The shirt is more of a modern approach. It's a modern pattern intended for cloth, and instead of focusing on designing something directly from the body, we're focusing on adapting modern resources to a traditional material, because there's different considerations with buckskin than with cloth. And those come in real big in this particular video. If you want to start at the beginning of the shirt, click the second link at the top of the screen, and then again, the end screens will lead you through the project. In this particular video, we start with the front panels made and the back panel made and its assembly and final touches. So we work in the sleeves. The sleeves are baseball stitched on, and working in the sleeves is a bit of a chore. It takes some extra work. The curve on the sleeve and on the body aren't perfectly identical, so you have to work and finagle it. With cloth, you would do that with a drawing stitch, but you can't do that in leather, so there's some different considerations to that. And then the same comes into play with the collar. The collar has to be re-engineered a bit as well. So we go through that. The additional stitches that we teach in this video are the, to attach the collar, we do the Spanish edge lacing of 2 loops, okay, which is a new stitch. These pocket flaps, that applique is single loop Spanish lacing, an adaptation of it, but this is double loop Spanish lacing, chosen because it's the smoothest edge lacing stitch, and I don't want it rubbing too hard on the neck there. We do this hem stitch, okay, which is the same of a stem stitch. If you're looking at crewel work or embroidery stitches, the stem stitch, that's what this is, just adapted to leather. Makes a really nice hem there. And on the sides, we do a hidden seam with a welt, and that's a new stitch to this project. So those are demoed in this video, along with all of the adaptation to make it work and fit and finish this garment. So, I hope you're interested, and we'll come join in for the fun. We are at the stage where we're going to start assembling the final shirt. But, before we do that, I want to take a step back and check my work. Do this. Do make prototypes, and do check your work, okay? Because the farther along you get, the harder it is to correct a mistake, right? Mm-hmm. This stage, you can still put in patches, you can change your stitch pattern, you can adjust for errors as you go, to a point. When it's all done, and you go to put it on, and you discover that something is completely lopsided, now you're done, right? You're not going to correct that at that point. So, I am going back to the original paper patterns, and you can see from the tears in this just how fragile this paper pattern is. That's why I've been transferring it to cardboard and working with that. But that's a lot of transferring. We've done a lot of alteration over the course of this. And I want to make sure that everything lines up well. Now, actually I'm going to do it on this piece. Okay. Now we added some to the bottom. That's fine. That's going to be different. What we want to do is make sure that the widths are right and all of the indexing triangles are correct. Okay? Within the context of our deliberate modifications. So, if I line this up and that up, we deleted a strip here and we added some length. That's not what we're looking at. It's going to be a little bulgy because I'm going over the top pockets. But you can see if I line these corners up, and this up, and that up, there's a tiny bit of woogity, but it all comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So the lengths and widths, the basic shape is fine. Very carefully fold this and set it out of the way. Now we're going to do the same thing on the back. Okay. So I blow my patterns around. So if we check the yoke, now we have to line up with the sew line, not with the seam allowance. Okay. And we're a little bit long, but not bad. Okay. And that's from that known error. One piece I cut right, one piece I cut too short. And we're a little bit long there, but not too bad. And here, and that one is spot on. Okay. So we will need to remember when we're working with this that we are a little bit long here in the sleeve, and we'll just have to leave a little bit extra wiggle goose room there in our sleeve. That's not fatal. So we have checked our work and we know where to be careful. Now, the next thing that we need to do, I'm just going to kind of fold that under to make a little space, is attach the front and back panels. My tools out of the way here. Okay. And
Yeah, that one goes over there.
these attach like this, with this being the sleeve hole. And like this. Now I made an error cutting this out and didn't leave that indexing piece. Okay. But that's okay because this is a very simple piece to line up. We can just line it up corner to corner. Okay. And then if I pull the sleeve pattern, you'll see that there is an asymmetry here. Okay. We have a wide indexing triangle here and a narrow one here, which correspond to wide here and narrow here. So that fits in like that when this is all said and done. The order of operations is connect these. Then after these are in, we address the sides and the sleeves. Okay? Sleeves going first, I believe. Always reference the instructions on that, but we don't need to get ahead of ourselves on that. Now, this has a full 5/8 inch seam allowance. This has a full 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do a baseball stitch. So, again, that's going to pull it together in a butt joint. So I don't need that seam allowance. We're just going to pull it together edge to edge. That's where the error was on here, getting those stitches crossed. Okay? So what we're going to do is take this, we're going to trim it a little bit. This is really where you get into your bravery test. after all of this work, and now we're going to go and cut some off. Okay, so we're going to measure down the 5/8 inch. In that corner. We're going to put a little clippy there, matching up corner to corner. But seeing the mark. And then the same here. Working on these edges, I like these clips a lot better than the cow magnets. Do use both. Measure that. And do at least one here in the middle. Okay. So there's our 3 marks. And now again, hide does not come in truly flat sheets. It is wrapped around round animals. So we have a little bit of wrinkly business there. I'm going to pull it up to a good spot. There's a little uneven in that cut, kind of splitting that difference. Okay. So we get that all set up. Put a couple extra clips on it. I'm just going to make a mess in the interest of time here. Okay. And now again, I'm going to double check all of this and make sure that's all lined up nice and square and true from both directions. Then we're going to transfer this line across. We're going to cut that. Okay. Before we cut that though, I'm going to measure down another 1/4 inch and punch all of the holes through both pieces of this. One of the nice things about doing this kind of work in leather is if you can get it all lined up, pinned and clipped the way you want, and you punch both sets of holes at the same time, you then don't need to worry about having it fastened as you're doing the stitch, because the holes will pull together just as you had it lined up as you do the stitch. I'm not going to show all of this on camera. These videos are getting long because there's a lot to talk about, and we did a lot of demonstration of the baseball stitch in the previous video. So I'm going to go ahead, get this trimmed, punch the holes, stitch it, same on this shoulder, and then we'll come back and look at the sleeves and the sides. We are, starting to look something like a shirt here. So the front and the back are now attached. We have this baseball stitch here at the shoulder. And again, necklines are always asymmetrical. The human body is asymmetrical, right? So the necklines have to be that way as well. So when we pull this down so that the bottoms meet, you can see this pulls out a little bit. Okay. So the point of the shoulder is here in the middle. And again, that's one of the things I like about this design, because I anticipate there's a greater than 0 probability that at some point I'll wear this with a backpack on. So, the back and the shoulders, I want to have the least amount of pressure right where a backpack has the most amount of pressure. So we're keeping the seam slim. We're going to baseball stitch the sleeves in as well, and that is the next step. So the sleeves have been cut out, and when you cut these, once again, this is an asymmetrical piece, okay? The armholes, the neckline, the shoulders, all of this is asymmetrical regions. Pockets are square and symmetrical, right? There's nothing really to fuss with about that. But when we have pieces that have an asymmetrical orientation, you have to make sure that you have mirror images when there's a right and wrong side to the material you're working with, right? So this leather has a right and a wrong side. The inside is, the flesh side is the inside and the grain side is the outside. Okay, so these are mirror images. The pattern has two indexing points, here and here. And this one is a double dot, double triangle, which I cut flat, and this one is a single. When I cut the sleeves, I messed that up a little bit, so I drew my double dots in there so I could keep them straight. Okay? So, what we will need to do now is turn this shirt inside out. And we need to get this aligned. So, which one is which? There, this one is... No, I was right the first time. There we go. Yes, this is the double dot, and this is the double dot indexing point there. Okay. Now, to lay this out, we're going to have it right side to right side, and we're going to bend this along. Now, if you're doing this in fabric, you would do a gathering seam. But that is something that we can't do in leather. So, right side to right side, we're going to start pinning key points, or I should say clipping key points with these little binder clips. Leather is malleable, it's flexible, it's stretchy, especially this stuff is super stretchy. And that's going to help us here. We still need to be very careful, because this is going to come and have to be held in a big old arc. Okay, so those are lining up. Here's a little pucker there. We're going to have some puckers. Okay, so there's one end. Now I'm not going to care about the middle of this at all. It's going to flop that in a pile. Set up this other end. We also, right now, we don't really need to care that much about where exactly all of the little binder clips go. And our pointing, if they get in our way later, we can always adjust them. Okay. Triangles. Okay. So now that set of marks is established. Just arranged a little bit more. You need to kind of find middle here. Fold all these tabs down. Just find what's globally middle of both pieces. Right there. Just going to put a clip on temporary here. Tuck that down in. Find what's globally middle. This piece. Which is right about there. And we'll pull this back. Need to save that spot. Pull this back out. Now we need to enmesh those 2 points that are globally central. Okay, that clipped on. So now we have our ends, our indexing points, and our middle clipped together. Now, here's where leather being stretchy is going to help a lot. If we can get this sort of kind of lined up there. And literally just stretch it and find the next middle. The next even middle. Which is there. And now we're just going to play a game of split the difference all the way around. Every time we split the difference, we're going to clip it. This is fiddly. This is a pain in the butt. And that is what it is. So as I'm looking at this, I have this big old pucker. This is central, so we're not going to adjust that. But I do want to spread this pucker out. Distribute the pucker. We're not going to get rid of the pucker. We're going to distribute the pucker. So all of that's pulled in. Now, let's kind of turn this out and make sure it looks like it's going to be... It's not going to be awesome looking because we've got all those clips in there. But...
It looks like a sleeve.
It looks a lot like a sleeve. Yeah.
Yay!
We do want to pull everything back out straight and make sure that we are at least in the right ballpark here before we go making any irreversible modifications. So we have all of this stretched out, set nice, and it looks a whole lot like a shirt and a whole lot like a seam. Everything's pretty much coming out about right. These last two indexing marks on the bottom of the seam, they're lining up. So yes, it looks weird because we have all those clips in there, but it's pretty much where it needs to be. So what we need to do is the same thing we did on those shoulder seams. We're going to grab and we're going to do a bunch of measuring. We're going to come all the way along. We're going to measure the 5/8 in. We're going to mark it. 5/8 in. We're going to mark it. Okay. We're going to get all of that connected up so that we know where the cut line is, because we're not going to need all this same seam allowance on that you would if you were doing a turned in seam here, since we're going to baseball stitch this. Okay. And then we're going to measure back 5/8, because we have to deal with this seam allowance too. So there's 5/8 there. We'll start a 1/4 inch in, and then we'll start measuring stitches. Okay. So once we have all of these stitch locations measured out all the way along, I'll punch them, and then I'll punch through both pieces all at once, and then I'll cut the seam allowance off, because again, baseball stitch is a butt joint. You don't need all of that extra material in there. Okay. And then separate it and just sew it together. And since we will have pre-marked all of these holes, it will naturally just pull itself together and gather as it needs to. This is a very slow, long, tedious process. I'm not going to film all of it, but I wanted to show you how this is all set up because that's the most important part. Shoulders are on, and this is starting to look like it might actually turn into a shirt someday. A lot of work in this, a lot of work, a lot of time. There's no denying that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is to sew up the side seams and the bottom of the sleeve and actually turn it into a shirt. Okay. To do this, we're going to do, at least on the sides, we're going to do a standard hinge seam, just like you would do in cloth. This is identical to the type of seam that we did in the leggings video. So it's going to be a running stitch with a welt. Now, just to get this organized, I'm going to put a couple of clips on here. These aren't going to stay here very long. I'm not going to show the running stitch itself because we've already done that. And this video series is getting a little long anyway, so I want to show you new stuff. We're just putting 3 clips on here in key locations. There. Now, in the leggings video, the welt that we did, I fringed. I'm not going to fringe anything on this shirt. So I am going to have a welt, which is an extra piece of cloth that goes in here. But I'm going to sew it so that it's a little extra wide and sticks out, and then just trim it to the side. It just gives a nice finish. Okay. So we're going to start working this in and tacking it. So it's just sitting right on the sewn edge with all of the extra going into the middle. Where did I get this welt from? Well, this is some of the seam allowance that I've been cutting off here and there. Okay? So we're still using that material. There's enough here that it should plenty wide enough for what we're doing. Okay. Now I'm just going to finish doing that all the way down. Now, if your welting isn't quite long enough, this one is plenty long, but if your welting isn't quite long enough, you can piece it. Not a big deal. Once we're done that, we're going to line up these sleeve pieces. Clip them in place. Okay. And if this was regular sewing, you would just run a seam, zip, and zip out. Okay. We're going to run a seam right along here. I'm going to cheat the seam allowance a little bit just to give that little extra room in it. So it'll be about more like a 3/8 inch seam allowance instead of 5/8, just a little shy of 5/8. Okay, we'll just make up the difference right here at that juncture. And then this piece we're going to measure, mark, trim, and baseball stitch just like we did the rest of the sleeve. Okay, so I will, and these are cut right there. There's not a permanent join right at that location. So I don't even need to nip anything. That will be cut there and stitched in. And this is going to be sewn right along there. There will be a teeny tiny little unattached location right at that corner that you will never see. The sleeves are attached. The sleeves are sewn at the bottom. And we have finished sewing up the sides with this nice welted seam, and you can see doing that running stitch just makes sort of a nice little zigzag there. It just looks nice and finished. You can absolutely do that and omit the welting, but having the welting in there just makes it look that much more finished. Right? I don't know how to say it. Just makes it look that much more finished. So I like that. Now, the next step is to hem this front flap. Okay, so this is doing a couple things. One is it is pulling this over to finish the lapel. Okay, if I turn this out, you can see that that rolls in all the way to there. Okay, so it's doing that, and it's finishing this front so it doesn't stretch out. Again, every material has its challenges. With leather, the two challenges are tendency to stretch and tendency to build excess bulk. So those are the two things you have to manage. In this case, we cut this, if you remember way back when to the first video in the series, we cut this from the hide in such a way that this was leaning toward the belly skin. There's a little bit of thickness here at the bottom, but overall it's relatively thin. So that's helping to manage bulk. And then doubling this over and doing a very solid seam here, okay, that's going to manage stretch. So that's how we're addressing these two issues. Now the original pattern piece, this was all one thing and just went straight down. So you had all of this big 3-4 inch chunk of excess that just got cut off at the end. That's why, why I cut this off here, because I don't want to waste that much of this precious material. So we're going to do the turn-in. The turn-in is still fairly substantial, okay? And that is a good thing because we're going to have to do a button attachment of some flavor here, and I'm still deciding what exact flavor I want that to be. But this is going to give us some extra material to work with in here to stiffen up those, button connection points. So it's going to be a little woogity at the moment. Once we get the buttons in, we will sew whatever we need to sew here and then just trim around it, and that'll take care of the woogity. So we'll be trimming off a little, but not that much. So the first thing we need to do, where'd my clips go? There's my clips. Is get all of this lined up. So we have these indexing points. Just going to clip them directly together. Okay. Then we cut this off and stop seaming right at that allowance. So I can just go straight down along here. And then on the inside, this pocket seam is right where I need to fold this to. So we can use that as our initial reference. Okay, just to get started here. Okay. So there's the start. You can see where we're going. And now you take Mr. Ruler and you make sure this is even all the way down. That's going to take 10 minutes or so of very fiddly work. I'm going to do that off camera and be right back. So use a lot of clips and make sure this is lined up real nice and straight. Now, you could do any number of stitches for this. You could do a simple running stitch. You could do a saddle stitch. But I'm doing a little bit of a decorative twisted stitch. Now, I've seen this under a couple different names. I have one book that calls this a stair-step stitch. I have another that calls it a French twist. And if you go and look at an embroidery book, they call it a stem stitch. Take your pick. I don't care. But it's a nice looking way to do a, a solid line of stitching that looks very nice and finished. Again, we want all of this to look finished. Rustic is nice, but finished. It needs to look finished. Okay? So, because it is a decorative stitch, I am going to measure width all the way down. Okay? The starting spot, if you could zoom in here, hon. The starting spot is going to be reusing, I'll use this one of the holes from this previous herringbone stitch. Okay? So I want to mark that on the back just by going through it with the awl. Now, as you can see, we've got some overlap and some wadding up of the leather. So just in terms of strategy, I'm going to go down this side all the way to the bottom. And then I will come back and I am going to trim this a little bit and refold it and remark it. Okay, so I'll do that off camera, but that's just this top line of stitching. I want this thick piece trimmed to that. Okay, and then I will make this thin piece match that wherever it falls. But that's going to be a later step. We don't need to worry about that right at this instant. A little scrap of something there. Is this in view, beloved? So I'm going to take this down a ½ inch. Should make a couple marks there. I'm going to do all of my marks on the reverse side. And then starting from that one, I'm going to just line up the yardstick. And a yardstick is handy for this rather than a flexible sewing tape, especially on this line, long of a line. I'm just going to mark my 3/8 inch stitches. There's going to be one right there. And one right there. Again, I'm just going to do a couple here to show you how to do this. I'm going to poke them. The clips are both very helpful and very annoying at the same time. It's a thing.
Also, while you're doing this and using the metal awl, be careful not to poke yourself in the fingers.
I have never done that.
Just like you're never sarcastic.
I'm never sarcastic. Okay. Now to anchor this, I just poked a hole in the end of this. This piece of thonging didn't really lend itself to the sort of leaving a thick spot at the end and then lodging that in the hole. So I'll show you the other way I do it. We're just going to start with a normal stitch between the first two holes, starting in the back and then coming across the front, just as though this was going to be a running stitch. Okay. Now I'm leaving a bit of a loop there so that I have room to fuss with this. So I'm going to thread this through that hole I poked. And kind of pull it tight and wiggle it back in until it's locked in place like nice. Okay, this works just as well. Now I need to come back through this first hole to the top. I'm going to re-widen it there with the awl. If you notice that my awl looks a little shorter, the finishing nail I have in there was starting to bend. So I trimmed it a little bit. You don't need fancy, complicated tools for this. Okay. This in view here, beloved? Okay. So we have a simple stitch, and we're back in the first hole. Now to start getting the curve, and at this point that's locked in so I can get rid of that clip. Find the hole on the other side. Okay. To start making the twist, we're going to go in the second hole, or sorry, the third hole at this point. Pull that almost all the way through, but leave a little bit. Now we're going to back stitch. I just poked my finger.
Hence the warning.
Yeah. We're going to back stitch and leave sort of a figure eight of loops. What we want to do is we want to have this come up in the middle of each stitch. And we want it to come up in the middle on one side or the other. So you can see here I've arranged this so it's coming up in the middle on the outside edge. Okay? This is why we left those two loops before pulling it tight. Because if you have this across and then you try to poke through, you're likely to pierce the middle of that. Okay. So now I'll go down to the next hole. Come down through. Okay. It's just more convenient this way. Leave that little bit of loop. Come in, start the back stitch. Okay. And now I'm going to hold this with my thumb. Pull that initial loop tight. Make sure it's nice and flat. And now pull the back stitch loop tight. And now I'm out, and I'm on the same side. And I'll show this one more. Okay. Pull it a little tight-ish, get it flat-ish. But leave that loop. Come through, make the back stitch. Hold that toward me with my thumb. Pull the loop tight. Pull the back stitch tight. Okay. You can see we're starting to establish that twist pattern. That first one's always going to look a little bit different, but the first stitch pretty much always looks different when you're starting one of these patterns. And then it's just a whole lot of rinse repeat as we go down the seam. It's a relatively quick seam. It's not quite as fast as a running stitch, about the same as saddle stitch, and a whole lot faster than any of the weaves that we've been doing, or herringbone stitch. and it gives a nice finish there. Now, I'm doing this extending over the hem. You could do this extending the other direction. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you are consistent. You will notice if you get on one side and then back the other side and do a few stitches and then back the other side and do a few stitches, you will notice a woogity in the pattern. Okay? So pick a side and stay consistent. You won't notice which side you picked. You will notice if you switch back and forth. So it's just a nice, orderly, even, consistent pattern. I'm going to go ahead and get all this done, and then we'll be ready to attach the last piece, the collar here. Second seam done. So the body of the shirt is a thing. I haven't entirely decided whether I want to hem it yet or not. I left myself space here that I have room for a hem if I want to put one in, and I would just need to take out a couple stitches here, which would be no big deal. So, remains to be seen. I'm not going to hem it on this video. If I hem it, it would just be more of the same of what I showed here anyway, right? I'll make that decision this winter or something, right? It's not going to happen here imminently. The last thing we need to put on this, other than just making some choices on buttons, is the collar. So this is the collar piece. We have 4 indexing tabs and a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now this is going to be handled just about exactly, actually I need to do it inside out here, just about exactly the same way that we handled the sleeves. So there's my little bucket of clips. The first thing we need to do is we need to reclip these lapel flaps. So with those clipped, just to hold that together, if you look at this, these are these middle 2 indexing tabs. And they line up with each other pretty nicely. That's not the tricky part. The tricky part is making a straight piece go around this curve. You can see this is fairly in line here, but when we go around the curve, it loses some distance. Okay? So we're going to match up that indexing tab, clip it there, and then do the same over here. I don't have a clip directly on that one. And you'll see how it's starting already to pull around a bit. Okay? So now we play a game of split the difference. Let it curve around, mold it in your hands, put on a clip, get it close, adjust the clip that's already there, come around again. That's not an indexing tab, that's just a little trim error. And we just work around. And I'll work around all of this once, get it as close as I can, and work around it again, get everything adjusted just a little bit more, see if there's any bulges. If so, average them out across all of the different locations. Okay, that's good enough for the starting conversation. And then once I'm happy with where that is, just like on the sleeve, we don't need to leave this turn in because we're not going to use it, right? We're not going to use that full seam allowance. So we're going to end up cutting that off. We have to leave it so that these indexing tabs can be used. We have to leave it initially. But it's going to get cut off in the final thing. So we'll work this around, ease it, measure down, mark our 5/8 all the way around, trace that, measure down again, mark our holes. And then this is going to be stitched on just exactly as it sits here. And I'm going to do that with another edge lacing stitch. All of the seam allowances have been cut off at this point. These on the outside 3 edges here, side, side, and back, these were never cut out. I trimmed my pattern piece back to the final dimension there. Because again, in cloth, this is made to be sewed all the way around and then flipped inside out. Okay, so it's hidden seam all the way around. And then those corners get rounded off a little bit by the fact that you're poking them out into the corner seams. I haven't quite decided if I want to round those off with the scissors. That's an easy thing to do later, and I'll probably wear it a couple of times and decide in a month. But that's whether or not I decide to round those corners has nothing to do with the progress on the shirt here. So what we're going to do is attach this using the last new stitch I'm going to show you on this project. And it's related to the stitch that we used for these little keepers. So this pattern, if you want to refer back to that in the second video of the series, this pattern is called Spanish lacing of 1 loop. It's normally done on the edge. I just did it on the flat. Okay? But Spanish lacing of 1 loop, because every time you pass through, where you go through a hole and then you go through a loop, and then you go through a hole and then you go through a loop, and you work your way around. There's a 1-loop version, a 2-loop version, and a 3-loop version. I think that the 2-loop version is the smoothest in texture, and since this could be rubbing up against my neck, I want it as smooth as possible. So I'm going to do the 2-loop version. So it's directly related to this, and it's basically the same mechanics once you get started, but it starts a little bit differently. So I got all this trimmed, pre-punched all of these holes, and then just to keep the collar right on the right part of the lapel, I just put a little scrap through there and just tied it, just to mark which hole was to be lining up with which hole. So, beloved, if you want to zoom in here. Okay. So, we're going to be making an X. And then we're going to be going through the X, and there's a loop on each side of the X, hence the 2 loops. The weird part about this is getting the X started. So the first step isn't going through a hole. It's placing your thonging between the first 2 holes. One is right there. One is right there. And the side facing you is the back side to me. Okay? So you hold it in between the holes on the back. Then we go through the first hole. Now we're going to leave all of this loose for a bit. Okay. And now we're going to immediately go through the second hole. Okay. And this forms our first X. So if I let that tag relax toward the standing end, you see I have this X. Okay? So now we're going to go through the X in between the second hole pass and the end. Okay. And then once that is done, we can tighten up that first portion. Okay. Now we still need to keep this end held down there and out of the way. through the X, and actually that needs to be over top of that. Okay, so there's our first loop, the one that just went through the X. Now I'm going to go through the third hole, which generates another X. Okay? Once you have the X, you go through the X. Leave that loose. Work that tight. Work this tight. Draw the loop to reasonable. Now I don't have an X, so I go through a hole. And that's the pattern. Once you get it started, it's very, very simple. When you have an X, you go through the X. When you don't have an X, you go through the next hole. And that's it. And it's being stubborn. This is much harder to do at this angle where you could see it than it is just to do on my lap. So going through the hole generated an X. So my next loop is through the X. When you have an X, you go through the X. When you don't have an X, you go through the hole to make an X. And that is Spanish lacing of 2 loops. And every time you pull it tight, take a minute, take your time, and make sure that you work it tight well. I just did that in the wrong order. Okay? And it makes a very nice little weave pattern across the top here. Through the X, through the hole, through the X, through the hole, through the X, through the hole. Every other stitch, through the X, through the hole, through the X, through the hole. And you can see it's completely covering this unfinished edge and will look very nice when it's done. As you can see, we're getting close to the end of this piece of thonging. This takes a lot of material. And in a long seam like this, you're never going to have a long enough piece of thonging to get the whole way. So I wanted to take a sec and show you how to join thonging. So here's my new piece. We're going to take this and poke it underneath the X that I just created here. Okay. Before we go through it with the working end. This gets a little bit congested, and you just gotta be very careful to make sure everything is going where it needs to be. Okay, and this came out okay. So that's all set. So we can tension this down. You do have to pull these in the right order. It's very fiddly. This is my current working end, yes. this new piece worked up so that it's directly over top of the pieces of leather that you're joining. And lash down nice and tight. Okay. We're just going to keep this nice and flat across. We're going to proceed. Don't have an X, so I go through a hole. Doing this through 3 thicknesses is tricky too. Okay. Everything nice, get everything flat. Go through the X. Tighten this down. Okay, so now I've tied this new piece down in 2 stitches. So now I can come out under here, because you always want, when you're going through the hole, you always want that to be on top. I'm taking the new piece of thong, using it to go through the next hole. Sorry for the hiccup, I got stuff twisted and had to get it untwisted here. So we've made our X using the new piece of thonging. Okay. So now we're going to take the old tag end, work it through here. Okay. And then we will go through the X with the new tag end. And now to tighten this down, you pull on the old tag end to tighten one loop, and the new tag end to tighten the other. And then from here, we will just wrap down the rest of the old tag end and lock that in place as we go along. So I hope you've enjoyed this, because we've got a lot more coming on the channel. Just a quick note, a couple things that I did do off camera are these button flaps. These are just set in with the same stitch we used for all the pockets, and I made a couple, took some scraps of bone from the fishhook carving project and just made these little toggles. And that is just a very, very simple toggle and hole process. I made the flaps partly because I didn't have a whole lot of room between these 2 seams to stitch that up, and partly you can see here that if I decide to change buttons, these will be easy to take off and just restitch the flaps. I just needed to get this done. I was out of time. I needed this outfit for a powwow that I was teaching flint knapping at. I just had to get it done. Right. If you're interested in bone carving and making bone buttons, there's a playlist. That playlist will be in the end screen. But I hope that you enjoyed this and will subscribe to the channel, because we're going to do a lot more leather working here. We're going to do more flint knapping. We're going to put those 2 together in some interesting ways, and we've got a lot of good stuff coming. So I hope you'll stick around and join in next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.